The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It drummed against the thin walls of the apartment with a sound that felt almost accusatory, as though even the weather knew Sarah Chen was drowning. She sat at the kitchen table, the overhead bulb flickering with the threat of another power outage, and stared at the pile of envelopes before her. Red ink stamped across most of them. Final notice. Past due. Eviction warning. Her daughter's laughter drifted from the next room, high and innocent, mingling with the murmur of cartoons on the television. Emma was 7, old enough to sense when her mother was worried, but young enough to still believe that everything would be all right. Sarah had worked hard to preserve that belief, even as their world contracted month by month, paycheck to paycheck, until there was almost nothing left to lose. She had been a teacher once, not a great one perhaps, but good enough. She had loved standing before a classroom, watching young minds unfold like flowers toward light. But when Emma's father left, when the medical bills from her mother's final illness buried her in debt, when the school district cut positions, and hers was among them, everything had unraveled with the speed of a nightmare. Now she worked 3 jobs, waitressing at a diner where the manager's eyes lingered too long on her body, cleaning houses for families who barely acknowledged her presence, stocking shelves at a grocery store during the overnight shift, while Emma slept at her friend's apartment down the hall. The exhaustion had become a permanent companion, a weight she carried in her bones. Her hands were red and cracked from chemicals, her back ached constantly. At 32, she felt decades older. The mirror showed her a stranger, hollow-eyed, her dark hair streaked with premature gray. Yet she kept moving because stopping meant collapsing, and collapse meant losing Emma. That was unthinkable. The knock at the door came just after 6 in the evening. Sarah rose slowly, her knees stiff, and peered through the peephole. A man stood in the hallway, older, wearing a gray suit dampened by rain. He held a leather briefcase and an umbrella. His expression was neutral, professional. She opened the door a crack, the chain still latched. "Sarah Chen?" he asked. His voice was calm, measured. "Yes? My name is Arthur Whitmore. I'm an attorney with Whitmore and Associates. May I come in? It's regarding a matter of inheritance." The word hung in the air like something foreign. Inheritance. She almost laughed. No one in her family had anything worth inheriting. Her mother had died with nothing but debt. Her father had vanished when she was 12. The few relatives she knew of lived scattered and estranged, their names little more than faded memories. "I think you have the wrong person," she said, beginning to close the door. "Your mother was Lin Chen, formerly Lin Zhang." Sarah paused. "Yes. Then I have the right person. Please, this will only take a moment." Against her better judgment, she unlatched the chain and let him in. He stood in the narrow entryway, water dripping from his coat onto the worn carpet. Emma peeked around the corner, curious, and Sarah sent her back to the television with a gentle touch. The apartment was small, cramped, of every surface cluttered with the evidence of lives lived too close together. Sarah felt ashamed, though she told herself there was no reason to be. Poverty was not a crime, but under the lawyer's polite gaze, she felt exposed. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to the couch. He did, setting his briefcase on the coffee table and opening it with a soft click. Inside were papers, neatly organized, and a manila folder stamped with an official seal. He withdrew a document and handed it to her. She took it, her hands trembling slightly, and read. The words blurred together at first. Legal jargon, clauses, stipulations. But certain phrases leapt out. Last will and testament. Deceased. Property transfer. And a name she barely recognized. Margaret Zhang. "Who is this?" Sarah asked, looking up. "Margaret Zhang was your great-aunt. Your mother's aunt. She passed away 6 months ago at the age of 93. Sarah shook her head. I've never heard of her. That's not uncommon. She lived a very private life. According to our records, she had no children and only one surviving relative. You. The room seemed to tilt. Sarah set the document down and pressed her fingers to her temples. Why would she leave me anything? I didn't even know she existed. I can't speak to her motivations, Whitmore said gently. But the will is clear. She left you a piece of property, a church to be precise. A church? Yes. St. Catherine's. It's located about 40 miles north of here, in a town called Ashford. The property has been abandoned for some time. Decades, I believe. The church was decommissioned in the early 1980s and has been vacant ever since. Sarah stared at him. The word sounded absurd. A church. Abandoned. Left to her by a woman she had never met. What am I supposed to do with a church? That's entirely up to you. You could sell it, though I should warn you that the market for such properties is limited. It's in severe disrepair. The roof has collapsed in places. The structure is considered unsafe. Most buyers would only be interested in the land. How much is it worth? Whitmore hesitated. The land is assessed at roughly $15,000. But given the condition of the building and the cost of demolition, it's unlikely you'd get more than a few thousand for it. If you're lucky. A few thousand. The words echoed in her mind. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had. No, it could buy time, pay rent for a few months, keep the lights on. How much does it cost to take ownership? There are some administrative fees, title transfer, processing. It comes to about $500. Her heart sank. $500. She didn't have $500. She had $17 in her checking account and another $43 in cash hidden in a drawer. I don't have that kind of money. Whitmore reached into his briefcase again and produced another document. Your great-aunt anticipated that. She left a provision in her will. If you agree to take ownership of the property for $1, the estate will cover the remaining fees. Sarah blinked. $1? Yes, it's symbolic, a legal formality. But it allows you to claim the property without financial burden. She looked down at the paper in her hands, then at the lawyer, then at the rain-streaked window. $1 for a ruined church. It sounded like a joke, a cruel prank. Yet the man before her was serious, his expression professional, his documents official. What's the catch? She asked. No catch. The property is yours if you want it. But I should be clear, it's not a gift in the traditional sense. The building is condemned. The town has been trying to force demolition for years, but without a clear owner, they couldn't proceed. If you take ownership, you'll be responsible for either repairing it or tearing it down. Either option will cost money you likely don't have. Sarah sat back, her mind racing. It made no sense. Why would anyone leave her something that was more burden than blessing? And yet, the alternative was to refuse, to let the moment pass, to remain exactly where she was, drowning. At least this was something. A thread, however thin, that might lead somewhere. Can I see it? She asked. The church? Of course. I'd be happy to arrange a visit. Tomorrow. Tomorrow works. She nodded slowly. Then I'll think about it. But I need to see it first. Whitmore smiled faintly, a small expression of approval. He closed his briefcase and stood. That's wise. Take your time. But don't wait too long. The estate needs to be settled, and the town is eager to resolve the matter. If you decline, they'll likely seize the property and demolish it themselves. After he left, Sarah sat alone in the quiet apartment, the rain still drumming against the walls. Emma called out, asking if everything was okay, and Sarah forced a smile she didn't feel. Everything's fine, sweetheart. But it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. She stared at the document on the table, at the name St. Catherine's, and wondered what kind of fool agreed to inherit a ruin. Yet as the hours passed and the night deepened, she found herself thinking not of the burden, but of the possibility. A church, a building, a place. It was more than she had, and perhaps in some strange way, it was exactly what she needed. The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city washed clean and pale under a gray sky. She dressed quietly, trying not to wake Emma, then slipped out of the apartment and down the narrow stairwell. Whitmore had said he would meet her at 9, but she couldn't wait. She had borrowed her neighbor's car, an old sedan that rattled and smoked, and she drove north through the empty streets, the city giving way to suburbs, then to farmland, then to something older and quieter. Ashford was not on any map she recognized. It was the kind of town that time had forgotten, a collection of weathered houses and closed storefronts scattered along a single road. The trees leaned close, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the sun. The air smelled of damp leaves and wood smoke. As she drove through, she saw no one. A few lights flickered in windows, but the streets were empty, as though the town itself were holding its breath. St. Catherine's stood at the edge of town, just beyond the last cluster of houses. The road narrowed to gravel, through then dirt, and ended in a clearing overgrown with weeds and brambles. The church rose before her like a monument to decay. Its stone walls were blackened with age and moss, the stained glass windows shattered or missing entirely. The roof sagged in the middle, collapsed in places, exposing the skeletal beams beneath. The bell tower leaned at a dangerous angle, its cross long since fallen. Vines crawled up the facade, strangling the masonry, and the ground around the building was littered with debris, broken glass, rusted nails, chunks of plaster. Sarah stepped out of the car and stood there, staring. The sight was worse than she had imagined. This wasn't just neglect, it was ruin. The kind of ruin that spoke of decades without care, without hope. The kind that whispered there was no salvation here. Yet she found herself walking toward it. Her shoes crunched over broken stones and shards of tile. The air grew colder as she approached, heavy with the scent of mold and wet earth. The front door, a massive slab of wood scarred with rot, hung askew on its hinges. She pushed it, and it groaned open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light. She hesitated at the threshold. Every instinct told her to turn back, but something deeper, something stubborn and reckless, urged her forward. She stepped inside. The interior was vast and hollow. The pews were gone, either stolen or collapsed into piles of splinters. The altar remained, though cracked and covered in bird droppings. The floor was littered with leaves and debris blown in through the broken windows. Above, the ceiling gaped open in places, and shafts of pale light cut through the gloom, illuminating clouds of dust that hung in the air like ghosts. The silence was absolute, not the peaceful silence of a church, but the silence of abandonment, the silence of a place that had been left to die. Sarah walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing. The walls were covered in faded murals, their colors long since bled away by time and water. She could make out the shapes of angels, saints, scenes from Scripture, but their faces were blurred, erased, as though even heaven had turned away. At the back of the church, behind where the altar stood, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. She approached it cautiously, peering down. The air rising from below was colder still, damp and stale. She had no flashlight, no way to see what lay beneath, but she felt the pull of curiosity, or perhaps something more. A sense that the true heart of this place, was not in the sanctuary above, but in whatever waited below. She turned away, deciding to explore later when she had better light. For now, she needed to see the rest. The vestry was a small room off to the side, its door hanging by a single hinge. Inside, she found old hymnals rotted to pulp, a broken organ, and shelves lined with bottles of wine gone to vinegar. The sacristy beyond was worse, walls streaked with black mold, the floor buckled and soft underfoot. She felt it give slightly beneath her weight and stepped back quickly, afraid it might collapse. By the time she emerged into the daylight, she was covered in dust and cobwebs. Her hands were filthy, her clothes smeared with grime. She stood in the overgrown yard and looked back at the building. It was impossible. Even if she wanted to repair it, even if she could somehow find the money, it would take years. And for what? To turn it into a house? A storage facility? The idea was absurd. Yet as she stood there, the morning sun breaking through the clouds and casting long shadows across the stone walls, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. The craftsmanship. Beneath the decay, the church was beautiful. The arches were carved with intricate patterns. The stonework, though crumbling, was precise and elegant. Whoever had built this place had poured love into it. It had been meant to endure, and perhaps in some small way, it still could. Whitmore arrived an hour later, his car pulling up beside hers. He stepped out, surveying the scene with a practiced eye. "Well?" he asked. "What do you think?" Sarah turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I think it's a disaster." "That's accurate. I think anyone who agrees to take this on is out of their mind." "Also accurate." She paused, then smiled faintly. "Where do I sign?" Whitmore blinked, surprised. "You're serious?" "I'm serious." "Ms. Chen, I have to advise you. I know what you're going to say. It's too much. It's too expensive. It's a burden I can't afford. And you're right. But I've spent the last 3 years drowning. At least this gives me something to swim toward." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, if you're certain." "I'm certain." He opened his briefcase and produced the documents. She signed them there in the dirt, her hand shaking slightly, the pen scratching across the paper. When it was done, he handed her a set of keys, old, heavy, corroded with rust. "Congratulations," he said. "You're now the owner of St. Catherine's." She took the keys, their weight solid in her palm. "Thank you. Good luck, Miss Chen. You're going to need it." After he left, Sarah stood alone in the clearing, the keys in her hand, the church looming before her. The wind stirred the weeds, carrying with it the scent of rain and old stone. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, its voice sharp and mocking. She thought of Emma, of the bills waiting on the kitchen table, of the future that stretched before them, uncertain, fragile, impossible. And yet, for the first time in years, she felt something other than fear. It was small, tentative, barely a flicker. But it was there. Hope. The news of Sarah's inheritance spread through her neighborhood faster than she expected. By the time she returned to the apartment that evening, her neighbor, Mrs. Rivera, was already waiting in the hallway, arms crossed, expression skeptical. "I heard you inherited something," Mrs. Rivera said, her voice heavy with curiosity. "A house." "A church," Sarah corrected, fumbling with her keys. "A church?" Mrs. Rivera's eyebrows rose. "You? What are you going to do with a church?" "I don't know yet." "Is it worth anything?" Sarah paused, the key halfway in the lock. "Not really." "Then why take it?" It was a fair question, one Sarah had asked herself a dozen times during the drive home. "Because it's something," she said at last, "and something is better than nothing." Mrs. Rivera made a sound that was half laugh, half snort. But something that costs you money is worse than nothing, Mija. But good luck to you." The conversation was repeated, with variations over the next few days. At the diner, her co-workers joked about her becoming a nun. At the grocery store, the overnight manager asked if she was planning to start a cult. Even Emma, when Sarah finally told her about the church, looked confused. "Can we live there?" Emma asked, her eyes wide. "No, baby. It's not safe. The roof is falling apart." "Then why did you take it?" "Because sometimes we have to take chances." Emma frowned, clearly unconvinced, but said nothing more. The real mockery began when Sarah mentioned her plans at the diner. She had been refilling coffee for a group of regulars, older men who came every morning to complain about the world, when one of them asked about the inheritance. "I heard you got a building," he said, grinning. "What? You gonna flip it? Make yourself rich?" "It's a church," Sarah said, keeping her voice level. "And no, I'm just trying to figure out what to do with it." "A church?" Another man laughed. "What did they leave you, the rubble?" "Pretty much. So you're going to tear it down, sell the land?" "Maybe, I haven't decided." "Smart girl would sell it fast," the first man said. "Cut your losses. Churches are worthless these days. Nobody wants them." Sarah said nothing. She poured his coffee and moved to the next table, but the words followed her. Worthless. Rubble. Cut your losses. By the end of her shift, the story had spread through the diner. The waitress who inherited a ruin. The single mom who thought she'd gotten lucky but was really just getting scammed. She heard the laughter behind her back, the whispered comments, the pity disguised as concern. It stung more than she expected. She told herself it didn't matter what they thought. But late at night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the doubts crept in. What was she doing? The church was a disaster. Even if she wanted to repair it, she had no money, no skills, no help. The smart thing would be to sell it immediately, take whatever she could get, and move on. But she couldn't. Not yet. The following week, Sarah drove back to Ashford. She had borrowed tools from a friend, a hammer, a crowbar, a flashlight, and packed them into the trunk of the borrowed car. Emma stayed with Mrs. Rivera, who had agreed to watch her for the afternoon, though not without another lecture about wasting time on foolish dreams. The drive felt longer this time. The road stretched endlessly through fields and forests, the sky low and gray. When she arrived, the church looked even worse than she remembered. Rain had fallen again, pooling in the foundation and turning the ground to mud. The front door sagged further, and she wondered how long it would be before it fell off entirely. She parked and sat for a moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The absurdity of the situation pressed down on her. What was she hoping to find? A hidden treasure? A miracle? This was real life, and in real life, ruined churches stayed ruined. Yet she got out. She grabbed the tools from the trunk and walked toward the building, her boots squelching in the mud. The door groaned as she pushed it open, and she stepped inside once more, the familiar smell of decay washing over her. This time, she had come prepared. She flicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, and began to explore more carefully. She examined the walls, tapping them to test for rot. She studied the beams overhead, checking for signs of structural failure. Most of what she found was bad news. The wood was soft in places, eaten by termites. The plaster crumbled at the slightest touch. The floor sagged dangerously in several spots. But there were also surprises. In the vestry, she found a locked cabinet. The wood was solid, the lock rusted but intact. She pried it open with the crowbar, the metal snapping with a sharp crack. Inside were old record books, their pages yellowed but legible. Baptisms, marriages, funerals. The names of people long dead. Their lives recorded in careful script. She flipped through them, feeling a strange kinship with these strangers. They had lived, loved, suffered, and been forgotten. Just like her. She set the books aside and continued. In the sacristy, she found a collection of old vestments, moth-eaten but still beautiful. Gold thread glinted in the flashlight beam, embroidered crosses and stars catching the light. She ran her fingers over the fabric, marveling at the craftsmanship. Someone had made these by hand, stitch by careful stitch. It was then, as she knelt in the dim light, that she noticed something odd. The floor in the sacristy was different from the rest of the church. The tiles here were stone, not wood, and they fit together in a strange pattern. She stood and studied them, following the lines with her eyes. It took her a moment to realize what she was seeing. A seam, a rectangle of tiles that didn't quite match the others. Her pulse quickened. She knelt again and pressed her palm against the stone. It was cold, solid. She tapped it with the hammer, listening. The sound was hollow, a trap door. She ran her fingers along the edges, searching for a latch or handle. There was nothing. The tiles were flush, perfectly fitted. But now that she knew what to look for, she could see the faint outline. A door hidden beneath the floor. She tried prying at the edges with a crowbar, but the stone wouldn't budge. She pushed and pulled, her hands trembling with frustration and excitement. Finally, she found a small gap in the mortar, just wide enough to wedge the crowbar in. She leveraged it with all her strength, her muscles screaming in protest. With a grinding sound, the stone shifted. Dust rose in a cloud, and Sarah coughed, waving it away. She pulled harder, and slowly, inch by inch, the trapdoor lifted. Beneath was darkness. A narrow staircase descended into the earth, the steps worn smooth by time. The air that rose from below was cold and stale, tinged with the faint smell of earth and something else, something she couldn't identify. She shone the flashlight down, but the beam only reached a few feet before dissolving into shadow. For a long moment, she stood at the edge, staring. Every rational part of her mind screamed to leave, to close the door and walk away. This was how horror stories began, the foolish protagonist descending into darkness, never to return. But Sarah had spent years being rational. Rational had gotten her nowhere. Rational had left her drowning in debt, mocked by strangers, clinging to the edge of survival. Maybe it was time to be foolish. She took a breath, tightened her grip on the flashlight, and began to descend. The steps were steep and uneven, carved from stone and slick with moisture. Sarah moved slowly, testing each one before putting her full weight on it. The walls pressed close on either side, rough and damp. The air grew colder with every step, and the sound of her breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. She counted as she went. 10 steps. 20. 30. The staircase seemed to go on forever, spiraling downward into the earth. She wondered how deep she was going, how far beneath the church. The thought of all that weight above her, all that stone and earth, made her chest tighten. But she kept moving. Finally, the stairs ended. She stepped onto solid ground and swung the flashlight around. The beam revealed a chamber, larger than she expected, its ceiling low and vaulted. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were objects, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Boxes, crates, bundles wrapped in cloth. Dust covered everything, thick and undisturbed. Sarah moved forward cautiously, her heart pounding. She approached the nearest shelf and brushed the dust away from a box. The wood was old, dark, bound with iron straps. She set down the flashlight and pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were books. Old books, their covers embossed with gold, their pages thick and yellowed. She lifted one carefully and opened it. Latin. The text was in Latin, illuminated with intricate drawings. She couldn't read it, but she recognized the style. Medieval, or older. She set the book aside and moved to another shelf. Here she found a wooden chest, smaller, more ornate. The lock was broken, and she lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of candlesticks, tarnished black, but unmistakably silver. She picked one up, feeling its weight. Heavy, solid, real. Her hands were shaking now. She moved faster, opening boxes, unwrapping bundles. More books, more silver. Chalices, plates, crosses. Religious artifacts, some of them centuries old. She found paintings, small icons on wood panels, their colors still vibrant beneath layers of dust. She found a reliquary, a small gold box adorned with jewels, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, glinting faintly in the flashlight beam. She stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the horde, and felt the world tilt. This wasn't possible. Things like this didn't happen. Not to people like her. Not to single mothers drowning in debt, mocked by strangers, living paycheck to paycheck. But it was real. She could feel the weight of the silver in her hands, see the gleam of gold in the darkness. The church above might be a ruin, but beneath it lay a treasure, a collection that had been hidden for decades, perhaps longer. Forgotten by the world, but preserved. Waiting. She thought of her great-aunt Margaret, the woman she had never met. Had she known? Had she hidden this here, or had she simply inherited it herself and left it buried? And why leave it to Sarah? Why leave her a ruin that held a fortune? The questions swirled in her mind, but she had no answers. Only the truth of what she saw before her. She picked up the flashlight and began to explore further. At the far end of the chamber, she found a narrow passage leading to another room. This one was smaller, more like a vault. The walls here were lined with locked cabinets, their doors bound with chains. She tried to open one, but the chain held firm. She would need tools, better tools. But through the gap in the cabinet door, she glimpsed more objects, more books, more artifacts, and something else. Bundles wrapped in cloth, stacked neatly. She couldn't see what they contained, but the weight of them, the careful way they were stored, suggested value. Sarah backed away, her mind reeling. She needed time to think, time to understand what she had found. She climbed the stairs slowly, her legs trembling, and emerged into the sacristy. The daylight was blinding after the darkness below. She closed the trap door, covering it with dust and debris to hide it again, and sat on the floor, her back against the wall. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Mrs. Rivera. "Emma's fine. When are you coming back?" Sarah stared at the message. When was she coming back? She didn't know. The world had shifted beneath her feet, and she wasn't sure where she stood anymore. She thought of the bills on her kitchen table, the eviction notice, the laughter of her co-workers. She thought of Emma, her sweet face, her innocent questions. And she thought of the treasure hidden beneath the church, a fortune waiting in the dark. She stood slowly, brushing the dust from her clothes, and walked outside. The sun was setting, casting the church in shades of gold and shadow. The ruin looked different now. Not a burden, but a secret. A promise. She drove home through the twilight, her mind already racing ahead. She couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. If word got out, the church would be swarmed. The treasure would be seized, stolen, taken from her before she even understood what it was. She needed time. Time to think, to plan, to figure out what to do. But as she pulled into the parking lot of her apartment building and saw the lights in her window, where Emma waited, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Not just hope, but certainty. Her life was about to change. And for the first time since she could remember, the change might not be for the worse. She parked the car and sat for a moment, the keys in her hand, the weight of the future pressing down on her. Then she smiled. A small, untired smile. And she got out, ready to begin. The following days passed in a blur of routine and secrecy. Sarah moved through her shifts at the diner, at the grocery store, through the hours of cleaning other people's houses, but her mind was elsewhere. Always elsewhere. In the darkness beneath the church, in the glint of gold and silver, in the weight of objects that whispered of centuries past. She told no one. Not Mrs. Rivera, who watched her with suspicious eyes. Not her co-workers, who had already made her inheritance a running joke. Not even Emma, who asked each evening if they could visit the church, if they could see what Mommy had inherited. Sarah deflected with vague promises and gentle lies. Soon, baby. When it's safe. When Mommy figures things out. But the truth was, she had no idea what to do. The treasure beneath the church was real. She knew that much. But what did that mean? Was it legal? Could she claim it? Would the church, the diocese, the town, or the state have rights to it? The questions multiplied faster than she could answer them, each one spawning 3 more, until her mind felt like a labyrinth with no exit. She spent her nights after Emma went to sleep hunched over her laptop, the screen's glow casting shadows across her exhausted face. She searched for information about treasure troves, abandoned property, religious artifacts. The laws were murky, contradictory. Some articles said finders keepers. Others warned of legal battles that could stretch for years. She read about people who had found fortunes and lost them to the government, to the church, and to distant relatives who crawled out of the woodwork with claims and lawyers. The more she read, the more frightened she became. Not of losing the treasure, though that terrified her, but of what would happen if word got out before she understood her rights. The vultures would descend. Lawyers, treasure hunters, opportunists. The town of Ashford would suddenly remember the church existed. The diocese would claim ownership. And Sarah, poor, exhausted, alone, would be crushed beneath the weight of forces she couldn't hope to fight. So she said nothing. She kept her head down and her mouth shut. But the secret burned inside her like a fever. The mockery continued at the diner. It had started as casual teasing, but now it had calcified into a running narrative. Sarah the fool. Sarah the dreamer. Son Sarah who inherited a pile of rubble and thought she'd struck gold. One morning, as she refilled coffee for the regulars, one of them, a man named Dale with a beer gut and a mean smile, called out loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "Hey Sarah, you tore down that church yet? Sold the bricks?" The others laughed. She forced a smile, said nothing. "Or are you still holding out for a miracle?" Dale continued, grinning. "Maybe Jesus himself is going to come down and fix it for you." More laughter. Sarah's hand tightened around the coffee pot. She wanted to tell them, wanted to throw the truth in their faces like scalding water. But she swallowed the impulse and moved to the next table. "She's going to end up in more debt than she started with," another voice said, quieter but still audible. "Mark my words, that place is going to bury her." The words followed her through the day, echoing in her mind even after her shift ended. She drove to her second job, cleaning the house of a wealthy family on the other side of town. The wife, a woman named Patricia, who wore yoga pants that cost more than Sarah's rent, greeted her with a tight smile. "Sarah, I heard you inherited something," Patricia said, leaning against the marble countertop. "A church?" "Yes." "How quaint." The word dripped with condescension. "What are you planning to do with it?" "I'm still deciding." "Well, if you need help with demolition, my husband knows a contractor. Very reasonable rates." Sarah scrubbed the floors in silence, her knees aching, her hands raw. Reasonable rates, as if she had money for any rates, as if these people, armed with their granite countertops and wine cellars, had any idea what it meant to live paycheck to paycheck, to choose between food and electricity, to inherit a ruin and be mocked for it. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the exhaustion, the secret pulsed. The knowledge that she was not what they thought, that beneath the ruin lay something they couldn't imagine. It sustained her through the long hours, through the ache in her back and the burn in her lungs. They thought she was a fool. Let them think it. When the time came, they would see. A week after discovering the chamber, Sarah returned to the church. She had waited, wanting to be certain no one was watching, no one following. She drove a different route this time, taking back roads, checking her mirrors. The borrowed car rattled and wheezed, but it carried her to Ashford without incident. The town was as silent as before, a ghost town in all but name. She parked behind the church this time, out of sight from the road, and approached through the overgrown yard. The building loomed before her, dark and forbidding under the gray sky. Rain threatened again, the air thick with moisture. She had come prepared this time. Better flashlight, work gloves, a backpack with notebooks and a camera. She needed to document what she'd found, to begin cataloging the treasure. If she was going to figure out what to do, she needed to know exactly what she had. Inside, the church was silent. The familiar smell of decay washed over her, but it no longer frightened her. She moved through the sanctuary quickly, her footsteps echoing, and descended the staircase in the sacristy. The trapdoor opened more easily this time, the stone grinding against stone, but yielding to her effort. She descended into the darkness, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The chamber lay exactly as she had left it, undisturbed, waiting. She set down her backpack and began to work. First, she photographed everything, each shelf, each box, each artifact. The camera's flash illuminated the chamber in brief, stark bursts, freezing the treasure in light before plunging it back into shadow. She worked methodically, moving from left to right, documenting every detail. The silver candlesticks, their surfaces blackened but intact. The illuminated manuscripts, their pages glowing with color. The chalices and plates, the crosses and icons, the reliquaries studded with jewels. As she worked, she began to notice details she had missed before. Markings on the boxes, dates carved into the wood, labels written in faded ink. Some were in Latin, others in languages she couldn't identify. She wrote them down, her handwriting shaky in the dim light, knowing she would need to research each one. In one corner, she found a crate she hadn't opened before. It was larger than the others, reinforced with metal straps. She pried it open with effort, the nails groaning in protest. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, were paintings. Not small icons, but large canvases, rolled tightly and bound with cord. She lifted one carefully and unrolled it on the floor, weighing down the corners with stones. The flashlight revealed a masterpiece, a religious scene, richly detailed. The colors still vibrant despite the years. She didn't recognize the artist, but the style was unmistakable. Renaissance, or close to it. She photographed it from every angle, her hands trembling. There were 6 more paintings in the crate, each one more beautiful than the last. Scenes of saints and martyrs, of Christ and Mary, rendered with a skill that took her breath away. She couldn't begin to guess their value, but she knew it was substantial. Museums would fight for paintings like these. She moved to the locked cabinets at the far end of the chamber. The chains binding them were old, rusted, but still strong. She had brought bolt cutters this time, borrowed from a friend, who asked no questions. She positioned the blades around the chain and squeezed with all her strength. The metal resisted, then snapped with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. She opened the cabinet door. Inside were more books, but these were different. Ledgers. Record books. She lifted one carefully and opened it. The pages were filled with names, dates, amounts. Donations to the church, she realized. But the numbers were staggering. Thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, all recorded in meticulous script. And the dates, some went back to the late 1800s. She flipped through the pages, her eyes widening. This wasn't just a collection of religious artifacts. It was a record of wealth. The church had been rich once, far richer than anyone in Ashford remembered. And somewhere along the way, that wealth had been hidden. Locked away in this chamber, beneath the earth, and forgotten. But why? Why hide it? Why not use it to maintain the church, to keep it alive? She thought of her great-aunt Margaret, the woman who had left her this ruin. Had she known about the treasure? Had she hidden it herself, or had she simply inherited the secret along with the property? Sarah closed the ledger and set it aside. She would need to read through all of them to understand the full scope of what she'd found. But that would take time, weeks, maybe months. And time was something she didn't have. The bills were piling up at home. The eviction notice was still taped to her door. She needed to act, but she didn't know how. She explored the rest of the vault, opening the remaining cabinets. Inside, she found more artifacts, more silver, more gold. Statues of saints cast in bronze, their faces serene and eternal. Vestments embroidered with gold thread, preserved in airtight containers. And at the very back, in the smallest cabinet, she found something that made her heart stop. A box. Simple, wooden, no larger than a shoebox. She lifted it carefully and set it on the floor. The wood was smooth, polished, unadorned. There was no lock, just a simple latch. She opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet, were coins. Gold coins, dozens of them, their surfaces gleaming in the flashlight beam. She picked one up, feeling its weight. It was heavier than she expected, solid and real. She turned it over, studying the markings. A date, 1889. An image of an eagle, wings spread. An inscription in Latin. She set it down and picked up another. 1902. Then another. 1875. The coins spanned decades, all of them gold, all of them pristine. She didn't know enough about coins to estimate their value, but she knew gold was worth something. A lot of something. She sat back, overwhelmed. The treasure was even larger than she had imagined. Not just artifacts, but wealth. Real, tangible wealth. Enough to change her life, enough to change everything. But the thought brought not joy, but fear. Fear of what it meant, of the decisions she would have to make. If she claimed this treasure, if she brought it into the light, she would be stepping into a world she didn't understand. A world of lawyers and appraisers, of taxes and legalities, of people who would want a piece of what she'd found. She would be scrutinized, judged, questioned. And if she made a single mistake, it could all be taken from her. She thought of Emma, waiting at home, of the life she wanted to give her daughter, a life free from fear, from poverty, from the constant struggle to survive. The treasure could give them that, but only if she was smart, only if she moved carefully. She replaced the coins in the box, closed it, and set it aside. She would take it with her this time. Just this one box. The rest would stay hidden, safe in the chamber. But the coins, she needed to know what they were worth. She needed to understand what she was dealing with. She gathered her things, took one last look around the chamber, and began the climb back to the surface. The stairs seemed longer than before, the weight of the box in her backpack pressing against her shoulders. When she emerged into the sacristy, the daylight was fading. She had been down there for hours. She closed the trap door, covered it with debris, and left the church. The drive home was tense, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. But the road was empty. She reached the city as night fell, the lights of the buildings flickering to life like stars. In her apartment, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table and opened the box. The coins gleamed under the overhead light, impossibly bright. She picked one up and turned it over in her fingers, feeling the weight of history. These coins had been minted over a century ago. They had passed through countless hands, had been buried and forgotten, and now they were hers. She opened her laptop and began to search. Gold coins, 1889, eagle. The results came quickly. American gold eagles. Double eagles, they were called. $20 gold pieces. She clicked through images, comparing them to the coin in her hand. It matched. She read the descriptions, her breath catching. Depending on condition and rarity, these coins could be worth hundreds of dollars each, some thousands. She counted the coins in the box, 43. Even at the low end, that was thousands of dollars. At the high end, tens of thousands, maybe more. She sat back, her mind reeling. This was just one box, one small piece of the treasure. What was the rest worth? The paintings, the silver, the artifacts, hundreds of thousands, millions. The thought was too large to hold. She closed the box and hid it in the back of her closet, beneath old clothes and shoes. Then she returned to the kitchen and sat in the dark, the apartment silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. She couldn't do this alone. She needed help. But who could she trust? The wrong person, and everything would fall apart. She thought through her options. A lawyer? Too expensive? And they would ask too many questions. A dealer? They would lowball her, take advantage of her ignorance. A friend? She had none she trusted with something this large. The answer came slowly, reluctantly. She needed an expert. Someone who could appraise the treasure, who could tell her what it was worth and what her rights were. But finding that person without revealing too much, without word spreading, would be almost impossible. She spent the next several days researching. She called museums, pretending to be a student working on a project. She spoke to appraisers, asking hypothetical questions. She learned the language, the terminology. Provenance, authentication, chain of custody. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. One name kept coming up. Dr. Helena Voss, an art historian and appraiser based in the city, specializing in religious artifacts. Her reputation was impeccable, discreet, professional, honest. Sarah found her website, read her credentials, and stared at her contact information for a long time before finally picking up the phone. The call was brief. Sarah explained that she had inherited some items she wanted appraised. Religious artifacts. Old. Dr. Voss asked a few questions, her tone polite but cautious. Could Sarah bring the items to her office? Yes, Sarah said. When? This week? Sarah agreed, her heart pounding. After she hung up, she sat in silence. She had taken the first step. There was no going back now. The day of the appointment, Sarah called in sick to the diner. She couldn't afford to lose the hours, but she couldn't afford not to do this either. She dressed carefully, trying to look respectable, professional. She packed 3 items from the chamber, a silver chalice, an illuminated manuscript, and one of the gold coins. Enough to give Dr. Voss an idea of what she had, but not enough to reveal the full scope. The office was in a historic building downtown, its exterior elegant and imposing. Sarah climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her legs heavy. The reception area was quiet, tasteful, filled with books and framed photographs of artifacts. A receptionist greeted her with a smile and led her to Dr. Voss's office. Dr. Voss was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore glasses on a chain and a cardigan despite the warmth of the room. She stood when Sarah entered, extending a hand. "Ms. Chen, thank you for coming." Sarah shook her hand, trying to hide her nervousness. "Thank you for seeing me." "Please, I sit." Dr. Voss gestured to a chair across from her desk. "You mentioned you inherited some religious artifacts." "Yes, from a great-aunt. She left me a church." Dr. Voss's eyebrows rose slightly. "A church? That's unusual." "It's in bad shape, abandoned, but there were some items inside. May I see them?" Sarah opened her bag and carefully placed the chalice on the desk. Dr. Voss leaned forward, her expression shifting from polite interest to focused attention. She lifted the chalice, turning it slowly, studying the markings. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to a pair of gloves. "Of course." Dr. Voss donned the gloves and examined the chalice more closely, using a magnifying glass. She was silent for a long time, her face unreadable. Finally, she set it down. "This is remarkable. Late medieval, if I'm not mistaken, or possibly 15th century. The craftsmanship is exceptional." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Is it valuable?" "Very. Depending on provenance, it could be worth anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000, perhaps more." The number hung in the air. Sarah tried to keep her expression neutral, but her hands were shaking. She set the manuscript on the desk. "I also found this." Dr. Voss opened it carefully, her breath catching. "A book of hours. Illuminated. The colors are extraordinary." "Miss Chen, where did you say you found these?" "In the church. There's a chamber beneath it." "A chamber?" Dr. Voss looked up, her eyes sharp. "What else is in this chamber?" Sarah hesitated. She wanted to tell the truth, to unburden herself of the secret. But something held her back. "More items. Books. Silver. Some paintings." "Paintings?" "Doctor." Voss's voice was carefully controlled. "What kind of paintings?" "Religious scenes. Large. Old, I think." Dr. Voss set down the manuscript and removed her gloves. She folded her hands on the desk, her expression serious. "Ms. Chen, what you've described sounds like a significant collection. Possibly a very significant collection. I need to ask you, do you have clear legal ownership of these items?" "I own the church. My great-aunt left it to me." "And the items inside?" "I assume they come with the property." Dr. Voss nodded slowly. "That's a reasonable assumption, but religious artifacts can be complicated. The church, the diocese, I mean, may have a claim, depending on how the property was decommissioned. And if any of these items were reported stolen or are considered cultural heritage, or there could be legal complications." Sarah's stomach twisted. "Stolen? I'm not saying they are. But it's something that would need to be verified. The provenance of each item would need to be established. Where it came from, how it came to be in the church, whether it was legally acquired. How long would that take? Weeks? Months? It depends on the item and the records available." Sarah felt the walls closing in. She had known it wouldn't be simple, but hearing it laid out so starkly made it real. "What should I do?" Dr. Voss leaned back, studying her. "You need to document everything. Photograph it all. Catalog it. Establish a clear chain of custody. Then you need to hire a lawyer who specializes in property and cultural heritage law. Someone who can protect your interests while navigating the legal complexities. I don't have money for a lawyer. I understand. But without one, you could lose everything. If the wrong person finds out about this collection before you've secured your rights, they will take it from you. I've seen it happen." The words were blunt, brutal, but Sarah appreciated the honesty. She looked down at the chalice, its silver surface catching the light. "What if I just sold them?" "Quietly." Dr. Voss's expression hardened. "That would be illegal. And foolish. The black market pays pennies on the dollar, and if you're caught, you could face criminal charges. Ms. Chen, I understand you're in a difficult position, but the only way forward is the legal one. Document, authenticate, and protect your claim. Sarah nodded slowly. She had no other choice. Will you help me? Dr. Voss hesitated, then nodded. I'll appraise the collection, but I'll need to see everything, the full inventory, and I'll need to be confident that you're the legal owner before I proceed. I am. Then bring me proof. The will, the deed, any documentation that establishes your ownership. Once I have that, we can move forward. Sarah left the office in a daze, the chalice and manuscript carefully packed in her bag. She had expected answers, but all she had were more questions, more obstacles, more things that could go wrong. But at least she had a path now. Document, authenticate, protect. The following days were a blur of activity. Sarah returned to the church again and again, each time bringing back small items to photograph and catalog. She worked late into the night after Emma went to sleep, her laptop glowing in the dark, filling spreadsheets with descriptions and measurements. She scanned documents, uploaded photos, created a digital archive of everything she'd found. The mockery at the diner continued, but it rolled off her now. Let them laugh. They didn't know. They couldn't know. She kept her head down and her mouth shut, moving through her shifts like a ghost. But the strain was beginning to show. She was sleeping less, eating less. Her hands shook from exhaustion and caffeine. Emma noticed, asking if Mommy was okay, and Sarah forced smiles she didn't feel. I'm fine, baby, just tired. One evening, as she was leaving the grocery store after her overnight shift, she ran into Dale, the man from the diner. He was getting into his truck, a six-pack of beer in one hand. He saw her and grinned. Sarah, still playing church lady? She ignored him, walking toward the borrowed car. Hey, I'm talking to you. He followed, his voice louder. You know what everyone's saying, right? That you're an idiot. That you're gonna lose that church and everything you put into it. You should have sold it when you had the chance. She stopped, her hand on the car door. For a moment, she considered telling him. Considered throwing the truth in his face, just to see his expression change. But she swallowed the impulse and got in the car. As she drove away, she saw him in the rearview mirror, laughing. The sight filled her with a cold, quiet rage. She thought of the chamber beneath the church, of the gold and silver and centuries of wealth waiting in the dark. She thought of Dr. Voss's words, to document, authenticate, protect. And she thought of the moment, someday soon, when the truth would come to light, when the laughter would die in their throats, when they would see what she had found, what she had endured, what she had become. She drove through the empty streets, the city sleeping around her, and felt the weight of the secret pressing against her ribs. It was almost too heavy to carry, but she would carry it, because she had no other choice. At home, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the box of coins. She picked one up, turning it in the light. It was beautiful, simple and timeless, worth more than Dale would make in a month, worth more than his laughter, his mockery, his certainty that she was a fool. She replaced the coin and closed the box. The chamber still held its secrets. The paintings still waited. I rolled tight in the darkness. The ledgers still whispered their stories, and Sarah still had work to do. The path forward was clear now, difficult, dangerous, but clear. She would document every item. She would authenticate the collection. She would protect her claim. And when the time came, when she was ready, she would step into the light and show the world what she had found. But not yet. Not until she was certain. Not until every piece was in place. She sat in the quiet apartment, Emma sleeping in the next room, and allowed herself a moment of hope. Real hope, not the fragile flicker she'd felt before, but something stronger. Something that burned steady and bright. The ruin had held a treasure, and the treasure would save them. She just had to be patient, just a little longer. The work consumed her. Every free moment, in every hour not spent at one of her jobs or caring for Emma, Sarah devoted to the treasure. She returned to the church weekly, sometimes twice a week, documenting everything with meticulous care. She photographed each item from multiple angles, measured dimensions, noted markings, and inscriptions. The chamber beneath the church became as familiar to her as her own apartment, its shadows no longer frightening, but almost comforting. Dr. Voss had given her a framework, a system for cataloging. Each item received a number, a description, a condition assessment. Sarah filled notebook after notebook with her findings, her handwriting growing more confident with each entry. The chalices and candlesticks, the illuminated manuscripts, the paintings, carefully unrolled and photographed before being returned to their protective wrappings. On the gold coins, each one documented individually. As the weeks passed, the full scope of the collection became clear. It was staggering. More than 200 individual artifacts, dozens of books, some dating back to the 14th century. Paintings by artists whose names she had to research, names that made her hands shake when she realized their significance. Silver and gold objects that had adorned altars for centuries. And the coins, over 300 of them, spanning nearly a century of American history. She brought the documentation to Dr. Voss in batches, careful never to reveal too much at once. The appraiser studied each photograph with intense focus, making notes, cross-referencing catalogs, occasionally gasping softly when she recognized something particularly rare. After the third visit, Dr. Voss set down her pen and looked at Sarah with an expression somewhere between awe and concern. "Miss Chen, do you understand what you have?" Sarah's throat was dry. "I'm beginning to. This isn't just a collection, it's a treasury, the kind of collection that major museums would fight over. Some of these items, I've only seen them in scholarly texts. I didn't know they still existed. Are they legal? Can I claim them?" Dr. Voss nodded slowly. "Based on what you've shown me, the deed to the church, your great-aunt's will, the documentation that the church was decommissioned and sold to private hands. Yes, the collection was part of the property. It's yours. But you'll need authentication, expert verification, provenance research. That takes time and money." "How much money?" "For a collection this size, tens of thousands. Maybe more. You'll need multiple experts, art historians, metallurgists, document specialists, and you'll need a lawyer, a good one." Sarah felt the familiar weight settling on her chest. She was trapped in a cruel paradox. She had a fortune, but couldn't access it without money she didn't have. "What if I sold just a few pieces to pay for the rest?" Dr. Voss considered this. "It's risky. If you sell anything before establishing full provenance, it could complicate your legal claim to the rest. But," she paused, "there might be another way. A private buyer, someone who understands the situation and is willing to advance funds against future appraisal. Is that legal? If done properly, yes. It would be structured as a loan, secured against the collection. You would use the funds to authenticate everything, and then sell legally through proper channels to repay the loan." It sounded complicated, dangerous, but Sarah was out of options. "Do you know someone like that?" "I might. Let me make some calls." 3 days later, Sarah met the buyer. His name was Marcus Wei, a collector and investor who specialized in religious antiquities. The meeting took place in Dr. Voss's office, neutral ground. Wei was younger than Sarah expected, perhaps 40, dressed in an expensive suit, but with kind eyes. He listened as Dr. Voss explained the situation, nodding occasionally, asking pointed questions. "May I see the documentation?" he asked. Sarah handed him a folder containing photographs and her meticulous notes. He studied them for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "This is extraordinary, Doctor." Voss wasn't exaggerating. "Can you help?" Sarah asked. "I can, but I need to be clear about terms. I would advance you $50,000 immediately. You would use that to hire experts, authenticate the collection, and establish clear legal ownership. Once that's complete, I would have first right of refusal to purchase items from the collection at fair market value. The initial $50,000 would be considered a loan at 5% interest, to be repaid from sales." Sarah's mind reeled. $50,000. It was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. "What if the collection isn't worth enough to repay you?" Wei smiled faintly. "Based on what I've seen, that's not a concern. Even a conservative estimate puts the collection's value in the millions, possibly tens of millions. If authentication confirms what Dr. Voss suspects, we're talking about one of the most significant private collections of religious art in the country. Millions, tens of millions. The numbers were too large to comprehend. Sarah felt dizzy, unmoored. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." "I know Dr. Voss. She vouches for you, and I believe in the value of what you found. This isn't charity, Ms. Chen. It's an investment. One I'm confident will pay off for both of us." Sarah looked at Dr. Voss, who nodded encouragingly. "It's a fair offer. The best you're likely to get." Sarah took a breath. She thought of Emma, of the eviction notice, of the bills that never stopped coming. She thought of the chamber beneath the church, of the treasure waiting in the dark. And she thought of the mockery, the laughter, the certainty of everyone around her that she was a fool. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." The contract was drawn up by Wei's lawyers, reviewed by a lawyer Dr. Voss recommended. Sarah signed it in a daze, her hand barely steady enough to hold the pen. The money arrived in her account 2 days later. $50,000. She stared at the number on her phone's banking app, unable to believe it was real. The first thing she did was pay rent, 3 months in advance. The landlord, a perpetually suspicious man named Mr. Kowalski, counted the cash twice before accepting it, his expression shifting from skepticism to grudging respect. "Didn't think you had it in you," he muttered, handing her the receipt. Next, she paid off the medical bills from her mother's final illness, the ones that had been in collections for 2 years. She paid the utility bills, bought groceries without counting every dollar, and took Emma shopping for new clothes that actually fit. Her daughter's face lit up with joy, and Sarah felt something break open inside her chest. This was real. This was happening. But she couldn't celebrate yet. There was still so much work to do. With Dr. Voss's guidance, she assembled a team of experts. Dr. Voss herself handled the religious artifacts and manuscripts. A paintings conservator named Catherine Liu was brought in to examine the canvases. A numismatist named Robert Stein evaluated the coins. Each one cost money, but Wei's advance covered it. They descended on the church like archaeologists uncovering a tomb, their equipment filling the sanctuary with artificial light, their voices echoing through the empty halls. Sarah watched them work, feeling both proud and terrified. Proud of what she'd found, what she'd protected. Terrified that they would find something wrong, some reason the treasure couldn't be hers. But as the days passed and the experts completed their assessments, the news was consistently good. Better than good. Extraordinary. Catherine Liu emerged from the chamber with tears in her eyes. "Ms. Chen, one of those paintings. It's a Caravaggio. An unknown Caravaggio. Do you understand what that means? Sarah shook her head, numb. It means that painting alone could be worth $20 to $30 million. Maybe more. The number didn't feel real. Nothing felt real anymore. She nodded, thanked Catherine, and walked outside to breathe. Robert Stein's report on the coins was similarly stunning. You have one of the most complete collections of 19th century American gold coinage I've ever seen. Some of these are extremely rare. The 1907 St. Gaudens double eagle alone is worth 6 figures. The total collection, conservatively, $2 million. At auction, possibly double that. The appraisals kept coming. The illuminated manuscripts, $5 to $8 million. The silver artifacts, $3 million. The religious reliquaries and gold objects, $10 million. Each number higher than the last, each one adding to a total that climbed beyond comprehension. When Dr. Voss finally compiled the complete assessment, she called Sarah into her office and handed her a document. The total estimated value of the collection, Dr. Voss said quietly, is $338 million. Sarah stared at the number. $338 million. Her vision swam. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. That can't be right. It's conservative. Some items could go higher at auction. The Caravaggio especially. Major museums will compete for these pieces. Wealthy collectors. You're looking at one of the most significant discoveries of religious art in decades. Sarah sat down heavily. Her hands were shaking. What do I do? You sell, carefully, through proper channels. Some pieces to museums, some to private collectors. Wei has first right of refusal, but you're not obligated to sell everything to him. You'll want auction houses involved for the major pieces. Sotheby's, Christie's. They'll handle the publicity, the bidding. It will take time, months, maybe a year. But when it's done, you'll be very wealthy. Wealthy. The word seemed absurd. Sarah thought of her apartment, of her 3 jobs, of Emma's worn-out shoes. She thought of Dale's laughter, of Patricia's condescension, of the preacher's sermon about pride. And she thought of the moment when they would all know, when the truth would finally come to light. When will the news go public? She asked. Soon. The authentication is complete. The appraisals are done. Wei wants to announce his purchases. The auction houses will want to promote the major pieces. Once word gets out, Dr. Voss smiled. Once word gets out, your life is going to change. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was at the diner, refilling coffee, when her phone began to buzz incessantly. She ignored it at first, but the buzzing didn't stop. Text messages, calls, notifications from news apps. She stepped into the back room and checked her phone. The headlines hit her like a physical blow. Single mother discovers $338 million art collection in abandoned church. Unknown Caravaggio found in rural Pennsylvania church. Janitor turned millionaire. The incredible story of Sarah Chen. The stories had her name, her photograph, pulled from somewhere, she didn't know where. They described the church, the discovery, the treasure. They quoted Dr. Voss and Wei and the other experts. They called her lucky, brilliant, a modern-day treasure hunter. The articles spread like wildfire, picked up by major news outlets within hours. Sarah stood in the back room of the diner, her phone trembling in her hands, and felt the world shift beneath her feet. It was out. Everyone knew. She walked back into the dining area. The regulars were still there, coffee cups in hand, but they'd gone quiet. Dale was staring at his phone, his face pale. Another man was showing his neighbor a news article, their voices hushed. When Sarah appeared, they looked up. The laughter was gone. In its place was shock, disbelief. something that might have been shame. Dale caught her eye. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he looked away, unable to hold her gaze. Sarah set down the coffee pot and walked to the manager's office. She knocked once and entered. The manager, a tired woman named Linda, looked up from her own phone. "Sarah." "I quit," Sarah said quietly. "Effective immediately." Linda blinked. Is it true? What they're saying?" "Yes." $300 million. $338 million. Linda sat back, stunned. Jesus. Sarah untied her apron and set it on the desk. "Thank you for the work. I'm sorry for the short notice." She walked out of the diner without looking back. The borrowed car was parked outside. She got in and sat for a moment, her hands on the steering wheel, breathing. She quit her other jobs by phone, cleaning houses, stocking shelves, all of it. Done. She was free. By the time she picked up Emma from school, the news had reached the neighborhood. Mrs. Rivera was waiting in the hallway, her expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. "I saw the news," she said. "Is it real?" "It's real." 300 million. "Yes." Mrs. Rivera shook her head slowly. "I told you it was foolish. Told you to sell." Sarah smiled faintly. "You did." "I was wrong." "Yes, you were." There was no malice in Sarah's voice, only fact. Mrs. Rivera stepped back, and Sarah went into her apartment. Emma ran to her, full of questions, having heard whispers at school. Sarah sat her down and explained as best she could. They'd found treasure. Old things, beautiful things, things that were worth a lot of money, enough money that they didn't have to worry anymore. "Are we rich?" Emma asked, eyes wide. "Yes, baby. We're rich." Emma hugged her, and Sarah held her daughter close, feeling the weight of years lifting. They were safe now. Finally. Truly safe. The following days were chaos. Reporters camped outside the apartment building. Camera crews. Interview requests. Sarah declined most of them, too overwhelmed to face the attention. But a few, the respectful ones, she agreed to. She told the story carefully. Her struggle, the inheritance, the discovery, and the long months of secret work. She spoke of perseverance, of faith in the face of mockery. The interviews aired on local news, then national. Her face appeared on morning shows, in newspapers, on websites. The story captured something people needed: hope. The idea that fortune could turn, that the overlooked could be vindicated, that perseverance could pay off. She became a symbol, though she never sought to be one. The church itself became famous. Tourists began to arrive in Ashford, wanting to see the place where the treasure had been found. The town, which had ignored the ruin for decades, suddenly embraced it. They spoke of preserving it, turning it into a museum, a historical site. Sarah agreed to donate some items for display to help restore the building. It seemed right somehow. The church had saved her. She could save it in return. Way purchased several major pieces, as was his right. The coins, some of the silver, several manuscripts. He paid fair market value, fulfilling his side of the contract. Sarah repaid his initial loan with interest, thanking him for the faith he'd shown. The remaining items went to auction. Sotheby's handled the major pieces, the Caravaggio, several other paintings, the most valuable reliquaries. The auction was held in New York. Sarah attended, wearing a dress she'd bought for the occasion, the first expensive thing she'd ever owned. She sat in the back row with Dr. Voss beside her, watching as the items she'd found in the darkness were presented to the world under bright lights. The bidding was fierce. The Caravaggio went for $42 million, another painting for $18 million, the gold reliquary for $12 million. When it was over, after fees and taxes, Sarah's share was still staggering, over $200 million, an amount that would change not just her life, but Emma's life and the lives of generations to come. They would never want for anything, never fear eviction, hunger, darkness. They were free. But Sarah didn't feel triumphant. She felt quiet, calm, as though the storm that had raged inside her for years had finally passed, leaving only stillness. She returned to Ashford one last time before leaving the city. The church stood as it always had, though scaffolding now surrounded it, workers beginning the restoration. She walked through the sanctuary, now empty of treasure, but full of memory. The light streamed through the repaired windows, casting colors across the floor. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the space, the noise of renewal. She descended the stairs to the chamber one final time. It was empty now, the shelves bare, the artifacts gone to museums and collectors. But standing in the darkness, flashlight in hand, she felt the presence of all that had been. The centuries of faith, the generations of hands that had touched these objects, the prayers whispered in Latin and English, and languages lost to time. She thought of her great-aunt Margaret, the woman she'd never met. Had she known? Had she suspected? Or had she simply passed on a burden, hoping someone would see what lay beneath? Sarah would never know. But she whispered a thank you into the darkness anyway, for the gift, for the chance, for the faith that someone, someday, would find the treasure and understand its worth. She climbed back to the surface and stood outside in the sunlight. A reporter had found her, asked for a comment about the restoration. Sarah thought for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "This church was forgotten," she said, "left to rot. People saw only the ruin. But underneath was something beautiful, something worth saving. I think that's true of a lot of things, a lot of people. We see the surface and think we know the whole story. But we don't. There's always more underneath, if we're willing to look." The reporter scribbled notes, thanked her. Sarah got in her car, not borrowed anymore, but her own, new and reliable, and drove away. She watched the church disappear in the rearview mirror, growing smaller until it was just a speck on the horizon, then nothing at all. She had bought a house in a quiet suburb, far from the city, big enough for Emma to have her own room, a yard to play in. They moved in on a Saturday. Mrs. Rivera helped, despite her embarrassment over her earlier doubts. Sarah bore no grudge. She understood that mockery came from fear, from the inability to imagine anything beyond the known. She forgave it because holding on to anger would only weigh her down, and she was done being weighed down. Dale showed up at the house one afternoon, unexpected. Sarah answered the door, surprised. He stood on the porch, hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for what I said. At the diner. And before. I was wrong." Sarah studied him. His face was sincere, etched with genuine regret. "Thank you," she said. I didn't know. No one did. That was the point." He nodded. I shifted his weight. "You're a better person than me. I would have rubbed it in everyone's faces." Sarah smiled faintly. "I thought about it. But what would that change? You were wrong. Now you know. That's enough." He left, and Sarah closed the door. Emma ran past, chasing the dog they'd adopted, a golden retriever puppy that filled the house with chaos and joy. Sarah watched her daughter play, heard her laughter, and felt a peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She had done it. She had survived. She had found the treasure and claimed it. She had endured the mockery and emerged on the other side. And now, standing in her home with her daughter safe and happy, she understood that the real treasure had never been the gold or the paintings, or the centuries-old manuscripts. It had been the strength she'd discovered in herself, the ability to keep going when everyone told her to stop, the faith that something better waited, even when she couldn't see it. The church had given her a fortune, but the journey had given her something more valuable. It had given her back herself. Months passed. The story faded from the headlines, replaced by newer scandals and tragedies. Life returned to something approaching normal, though normal now meant financial security beyond imagining. Sarah invested wisely, hired advisors, set up trusts for Emma's education and future. She donated generously to causes she cared about: scholarships for single mothers, preservation of historic buildings, programs for children in poverty. She stayed in touch with Dr. Voss, who had become a friend. They met for coffee occasionally, talking about art and history and the strange turns life could take. Wei kept in contact as well, sending photos of the items he'd purchased displayed in his private collection. The Caravaggio went to a museum in Italy, where it hung beside others by the same artist, finally home. The church restoration was completed after a year. Sarah attended the rededication ceremony, standing among town officials and preservationists and tourists who'd come to see the famous site. The building gleamed, its stone cleaned, its windows restored, its structure sound. It was beautiful. More beautiful than it had been in decades, perhaps in a century. A plaque was installed near the entrance. In honor of Sarah Chen, who saw beauty where others saw only ruin, and whose discovery helped preserve this historic treasure for future generations. Sarah read it and felt tears prick her eyes, not for the honor, but for what it represented: the journey from mockery to respect, from poverty to abundance, from despair to hope. She had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but tempered. She thought of the woman she'd been a year ago, exhausted, defeated, drowning. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life. Yet she was grateful for her stubborn refusal to give up, for her willingness to take a chance on something everyone said was foolish. Because without that woman's courage, Sarah wouldn't be standing here now. Emma tugged at her hand. "Mommy, can we go inside?" "Of course, baby." They walked through the restored sanctuary together, Emma's footsteps echoing off the polished stone. The air smelled of wood polish and fresh paint. Light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in rainbows. It was a place of peace again, a place where people could come and remember that beauty existed, that history mattered, that even what seemed lost could sometimes be found. In the vestry, now converted to a small museum, several items from the collection were displayed. Not the most valuable, those had gone to major museums, but significant pieces nonetheless. A chalice, an illuminated manuscript, several silver candlesticks. Cards beside each one explained their history, their significance, how they had been found. Visitors moved through quietly, reverently, taking photos, reading the cards. Sarah watched them and felt a strange contentment. These objects, which had been hidden in darkness for so long, were now sharing their light with the world. That felt right. That felt like the ending the story deserved. She and Emma left the church as the sun began to set. The sky was painted orange and pink, clouds drifting like smoke. They got in the car and drove home through the quiet streets. Emma chattered about what she'd seen, about the pretty chalice and the golden cross. Sarah listened, smiling, her heart full. At home, after Emma was in bed, Sarah sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The night was warm, full of cricket songs and the rustle of leaves. She thought about the journey, the fear and the struggle, the mockery and the doubt, the long months of secret work, the moment when the truth had finally come to light. And now, this. Peace, security, freedom. She had been given a gift, and she realized, not just the treasure, though that was part of it, but the gift of learning who she was, of discovering that she was stronger than she'd known, that she could endure more than she'd imagined, that she was worthy of good things, of abundance, of joy. The church had been a ruin, but ruins could be rebuilt. Lives could be transformed. Hope could be restored. She was living proof. She finished her tea and went inside. Tomorrow she would wake in her comfortable bed, in her beautiful house, without fear of eviction or hunger or darkness. Tomorrow Emma would wake safe and happy, her future secure. Tomorrow they would continue building the life they deserved. But tonight, Sarah simply sat in the quiet of her home and felt grateful. Grateful for the ruin that had held a treasure. Grateful for the great aunt she'd never met, who had left her a chance. Grateful for the strength that had carried her through, and grateful for the future that stretched ahead, bright with possibility. The treasure beneath the church had saved her life, but the journey to claim it had saved her soul. And that, she thought, was worth more than all the gold in the world. Years later, when people asked her about the discovery, Sarah always said the same thing. I wasn't lucky. I was patient. I kept going when everyone told me to stop. I believed in something I couldn't see yet. And that made all the difference. It became her philosophy. Keep going. Keep believing. Even when the world laughs. Even when the path is dark. Because sometimes, beneath the ruin, treasure waits. And sometimes, the treasure isn't gold at all, but the strength you discover in yourself, the life you build from nothing, the hope that survives against all odds. Sarah Chen had inherited a church for $1, and in return, she had found everything. Not just wealth, but purpose. Not just security, but meaning. Not just survival, but life itself. And in the quiet moments, when she thought back to that first day, standing in the rain, staring at the ruin, holding rusty keys in her trembling hand, she smiled. Because she had taken the chance. She had walked through the door. She had descended into the darkness and emerged into light. And that, she knew, was the real miracle. Not what she found beneath the church, but what she found within herself. The wealth changed everything, but not in the ways Sarah had imagined. The first month after the money arrived, she found herself paralyzed by choices. Every decision, and from what to buy for dinner to where Emma should go to school, carried a weight it never had before. When you have nothing, your options are limited. When you have everything, the world opens so wide, it becomes terrifying. She hired a financial advisor, a woman named Rebecca Torres, who specialized in helping lottery winners and sudden wealth recipients. Rebecca had kind eyes and a no-nonsense approach that Sarah appreciated. Their first meeting lasted 3 hours. The statistics are grim, Rebecca said, sliding a folder across the desk. 70% of people who receive sudden wealth are broke within 5 years. They give too much away. They spend recklessly. They trust the wrong people. My job is to make sure you're not one of them. Sarah listened as Rebecca outlined a plan. Conservative investments, trust funds, a monthly allowance that seemed enormous to Sarah, but was actually a tiny fraction of her total wealth. The goal, Rebecca explained, is to make sure this money lasts not just your lifetime, but Emma's and her children's and their children's. We're building generational wealth. Generational wealth, the phrase sounded alien. Sarah had grown up thinking about surviving month to month. Now she was being asked to think in terms of centuries. But she followed Rebecca's advice. She resisted the urge to buy everything she'd ever wanted. No mansion, no sports cars, no private jets. Instead, she bought a comfortable 4-bedroom house in a good school district. She bought a reliable car, new but practical. She set aside money for Emma's education, for retirement, for emergencies. The rest was invested, diversified across stocks and bonds and real estate. It felt strange, having so much money and living so modestly. Friends from her old life couldn't understand it. Why wasn't she living in luxury? Why was she still shopping at regular grocery stores, still driving a Honda instead of a Mercedes? The question irritated her. She hadn't survived years of poverty just to throw away her fortune on things she didn't need. But there were indulgences. She hired a tutor for Emma, a patient woman who helped her daughter fall in love with reading. She bought a piano and paid for lessons, filling the house with music. She renovated the kitchen, installed solar panels, planted a garden. Small improvements that made their house feel like a home. And she traveled. Not extravagantly, but meaningfully. She and Emma spent a month in Italy, now walking through museums, eating gelato in piazzas, seeing the world Sarah had only read about in books. They went to Japan, to Peru, to Ireland. Each trip was a lesson, a way of showing Emma that life was bigger than their small corner of the world. But the most important thing Sarah did with her money was help others. She couldn't forget where she'd come from, couldn't forget the terror of opening bills she couldn't pay, of choosing between food and medicine, of lying awake at night, wondering if tomorrow would be the day they lost everything. She started small. Anonymous donations to families facing eviction. Grocery store gift cards left in mailboxes. Quietly paying off medical bills for people drowning in debt. She did it secretly at first, not wanting attention, so just wanting to ease the burden for others the way her burden had been eased. But eventually, she decided to do more. She established a foundation, the Margaret Zhang Foundation, named after the great-aunt who had given her a chance. The foundation focused on 3 areas: supporting single parents in financial crisis, preserving historic buildings, and providing educational scholarships for children from low-income families. The work consumed her in the best possible way. She hired staff, rented office space, developed programs. She met with social workers and teachers and community leaders, learning where the need was greatest. The foundation gave out its first grants 6 months after being established. $50,000 to a shelter for homeless families, $25,000 to a literacy program, on individual grants of $5,000 to $10,000 to single parents facing emergency situations. Sarah read every application personally. She saw herself in every story. The single mother working 3 jobs, the father trying to keep his children fed after losing his job, the grandparent raising grandchildren on a fixed income. Each one was her, from a year ago. Each one deserved a chance. She didn't just write checks. She showed up. She visited the shelter, spent afternoons reading to children. She attended foundation events, spoke to grant recipients, listened to their stories. People were often surprised to meet her. They expected someone distant, someone who had forgotten what struggle felt like. But Sarah never forgot. She couldn't. The memory was too recent, too raw. One afternoon, she met a woman named Rosa at one of the foundation's events. Rosa was in her early 30s, with tired eyes and a nervous smile. She had received a grant to pay for childcare while she completed her nursing degree. As they talked, Rosa began to cry. "I'm sorry," Rosa said, wiping her eyes. "It's just, nobody has ever helped me like this. Nobody's ever believed I could do it." Sarah took her hand. "You can do it. I know you can. Because I was you. A year ago, I was exactly where you are." Rosa looked at her in disbelief. "But you're successful. You're rich. A year ago, I was being evicted. I worked 3 jobs and still couldn't make rent. I know what it feels like to be drowning. But things can change. Sometimes all we need is a little help, and someone who believes in us when we can't believe in ourselves. The conversation stayed with Sarah for days. She realized that her story wasn't just about finding treasure. It was about what she did with it, about using her good fortune to lift others. That was the real wealth, not the money itself, but the ability to make someone else's life easier, to give them the chance she'd been given. The foundation grew. After a year, they'd helped over 200 families. After 2 years, over 500. Sarah attended every graduation ceremony of scholarship recipients, shook every hand, took every photo. She wanted them to know they weren't just numbers on a form. They were people. They mattered. But success brought its own complications. People she hadn't heard from in years suddenly reached out. Distant cousins, old classmates, friends of friends. All of them had stories. Hard luck, medical emergencies, business opportunities. Could Sarah help? Just this once? At first, she tried to help everyone, but Rebecca warned her that was unsustainable. "You can't save the world," Rebecca said gently. "You have to set boundaries. Say no. Otherwise, you'll be broke in 5 years like everyone else." It was the hardest lesson Sarah had to learn. Saying no, drawing lines, understanding that helping someone didn't mean solving all their problems. She created guidelines for personal requests, only immediate family, and only for genuine emergencies. Everything else went through the foundation, where applications were evaluated fairly. Some people understood, others didn't. She lost friendships over it. People accused her of being cold, of forgetting where she came from. The criticism stung, but Sarah held firm. She had worked too hard, survived too much, to let guilt manipulate her into poor decisions. Meanwhile, Emma thrived. She excelled in her new school, made friends easily, discovered a passion for science. She was too young to fully understand their financial situation, but she understood they were safe now. That was enough. Sarah made sure to keep her grounded, to teach her that money was a tool, not a measure of worth. They volunteered together at the foundation. Emma helped sort donations, played with younger children at family events, learned that having more meant giving more. Sarah watched her daughter grow with pride, knowing that Emma would never experience the fear that had defined Sarah's own childhood. That alone made everything worthwhile. 2 years after the discovery, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference for nonprofit leaders. She almost declined. Public speaking terrified her, but Dr. Voss encouraged her to accept. "Your story needs to be heard," Dr. Voss said. "Not just the treasure part, the whole story." Sarah stood on stage in front of 300 people, her hands shaking, her voice thin at first, but growing stronger. She told them about the poverty, the mockery, the fear. About inheriting a ruin and taking a chance. About the months of secret work, the authentication process, the moment when everything changed. But she spent the most time talking about what came after, about the foundation, about helping others, about understanding that wealth meant nothing if you didn't use it for good. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then the applause began. People stood. Sarah stood at the podium, overwhelmed, tears streaming down her face. After she stepped off stage, dozens of people approached her. They thanked her. They told her their own stories of struggle and survival. They said her words gave them hope. That night, lying in bed, Sarah thought about how strange life was. A year ago, she'd been invisible. Now people wanted to hear what she had to say. But she hadn't changed. Not really. She was still the same woman who had scrubbed floors and waited tables. The same woman who had lain awake at night, wondering how to keep her daughter fed. The world saw her differently now, but inside, she was still her. The church in Ashford became a tourist destination. Thousands of people visited each year, drawn by the story of the treasure. The town, which had been dying slowly for decades, has experienced a small renaissance. New businesses opened, cafes, gift shops, a bed and breakfast. Jobs returned. Young families moved in. The mayor credited Sarah with saving the town, but Sarah deflected the praise. She had just found what was already there. She donated money for the town's schools, for a new library, for renovating the main street. She didn't do it for recognition, but the town insisted on honoring her. They named a park after her, erected a small monument. At the dedication ceremony, the mayor called her a hero. Sarah stood beside the monument, feeling embarrassed and grateful in equal measure. An elderly woman approached her afterward. Her name was Judith, and she had lived in Ashford her entire life. "I remember when that church was still active," Judith said, her voice soft with memory. "I was married there. 63 years ago. I never thought I'd see it beautiful again. Thank you for bringing it back." Sarah hugged her, feeling the weight of history in that embrace. The church wasn't just a building. It was memories, lives, love stories. By saving it, she had preserved something precious. That meant more than all the gold and silver she'd found beneath it. But not everything was peaceful. There were lawsuits, people claiming they had rights to the treasure, that the church should have reverted to the diocese, that Sarah's great-aunt's will was invalid. Sarah's lawyers fought each case, and each one was dismissed. The treasure was legally hers. But the battles were exhausting, a reminder that wealth attracted vultures. There were also threats, anonymous letters claiming Sarah had stolen the treasure, that she didn't deserve it. When security became necessary, she installed alarms, cameras, hired a part-time security guard. It infuriated her that money meant losing privacy, losing the simple freedom to move through the world without fear. But she adapted. She had to. The third anniversary of the discovery arrived quietly. Sarah marked it by returning to Ashford alone. She walked through the restored church, remembering what it had been. The darkness, the decay, the silence. Now it was full of light, full of life. Visitors moved through the small museum, studying the artifacts she'd donated, reading about the discovery. She descended the stairs to the chamber, now part of the museum tour, with proper lighting and safety railings. The shelves were empty. The space transformed into an exhibit space, with placards explaining what had been found and where each piece had gone. She stood in the center of the room, where she'd first stood, with her flashlight trembling in her hand, and felt the ghost of that moment. She had been so afraid, so uncertain. She hadn't known if she was brave or foolish, hadn't known if the treasure would save her or destroy her. But she had taken the risk. She had trusted herself, and that decision had changed everything. A young couple entered the chamber, cameras in hand, reading the placards with interest. They didn't notice Sarah standing in the corner. She listened as they talked, speculating about what it must have been like to make such a discovery, to go from nothing to everything overnight. They called her lucky. They said they wished it would happen to them. Sarah smiled and left them to their fantasies. Luck had nothing to do with it. Or rather, luck was only a small part. The rest was perseverance, courage, the willingness to take a chance when everyone said you were a fool. That was the real lesson, though few people wanted to hear it. They wanted the treasure without the struggle, the reward without the risk. But life didn't work that way. She drove home through the countryside, windows down, spring air rushing in. She thought about writing a book. People had asked her to. Publishers had made offers. But she wasn't ready. The story was still too close, too personal. Maybe someday. For now, she wanted to live it, not recount it. Emma was waiting when she got home, sprawled on the living room floor doing homework. The dog lay beside her, the tail thumping lazily. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching, feeling a contentment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. This was the treasure. Not gold or paintings, but safety, peace, the knowledge that tomorrow would come, and the next day, and the day after that, without fear. That evening, after Emma went to bed, Sarah sat at her desk and wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific, just to herself, a reminder of where she'd been and where she was going. She wrote about the poverty, the fear, the moment she'd decided to take a chance on a ruined church. She wrote about the discovery, the authentication, the vindication. She wrote about the foundation, the lives they'd touched, the good they'd done. And she wrote about the future, the years ahead, the work still to be done, the life she would build from this impossible beginning. When she finished, she folded the letter and put it in a drawer. Someday, when Emma was older, she would give it to her, so her daughter would understand that miracles didn't just happen. They were made by people who refused to give up, by people who saw possibility where others saw only ruin, by people who believed that beneath the darkness, light was waiting. Sarah turned off the desk lamp and walked to the window. The street was quiet, the houses dark. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary night. But Sarah knew there was no such thing as ordinary. Every moment carried the potential for transformation. Every ruin held the possibility of treasure. Every person walking through darkness was one decision away from light. She had been given a gift, not just wealth, but perspective. She understood now that life was not about what you had, but what you did with what you were given. She had been given poverty, and she had survived. She had been given mockery, and she had persisted. She had been given a chance, and she had seized it. And now, she had been given abundance, and she would use it wisely. The future stretched ahead, vast and unknowable. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She had walked through darkness before. She had found treasure in the depths. She had transformed her life and was now transforming others. Whatever came next, she would face it the way she had faced everything else. With courage, with grace, with the quiet certainty that she was stronger than she knew. She stood at the window a moment longer, then turned away. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities. Tonight, and she would sleep in her comfortable bed, in her safe home, knowing that the girl who had once trembled before a ruined church had become a woman who could face anything. And that transformation, from fear to strength, from poverty to purpose, from mockery to meaning, was the greatest treasure of all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.